gotten cut off. So just a quick reminder, you should have gotten a little screen that popped up to say you are aware that we're recording, so that people will have access to this. Dina, sorry that we got cut off, but I grew up right down the street from Kaneohe Elementary. I went to Kaneohe Elementary, so that's kind of the area that I grew up in. And it was when we sold my parents' house that, of course, we had to use title guarantee. So it's again, wonderful just to make these connections, and really, truly, again, the world just keeps getting a little smaller. So with that and the opportunity to connect, maybe if you could go and take us back to the big screen, I would love to hear either what are some of the, let's just open mic this. If you can go back to the Brady Bunch squares, I'm dating myself when I say that, Brady Bunch squares, all the squares, just to say maybe just a couple shout outs of maybe take me off big screen and just share out the group. What are some of the personal or professional learnings? I'd love to grab a couple people just to say, to share your perspective, either personally or professionally. Someone please volunteer to share their perspective and introduce yourself. How's that, Jerome?
How's it, Kimo? Thanks again for supporting ATD Hawai'i.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, just some things that from my last group that we talked about, and Daryl and Makana and Christy, I'm just gonna share everybody's. Some of the things that came up were, one, compassion for others, because we're living in such a world where division is so prevalent. But finding compassion, that was a big one. Technology and how that's evolved and made us able to connect. Embracing your introvertedness. How the pandemic has allowed us to, if you're an introvert, this is like the best time for you. And then finally, and the technology part touched on it, connection. And how if you weren't necessarily with family, realizing how important the time you spend with those that you love, it was really hyper intensified. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jerome. Nice recap. Anyone else? And you just feel free to just jump in. Someone else.
Hi, this is Cindy from Bank. In our group, we had working professionals raising young kids at home, and then the stress that they incurred while managing big projects and homeschooling and technology. But I think the key message was all about adaptability and then being patient with ourselves, but just being flexible and kind of going with the flow. As much as we would love to have predictability and a plan, we have to be flexible.
Absolutely. And I think savor in the fact that you are in Hawaii, and it is just truly just beautiful. And there's just, look at the sunrise, look at the sunset, and or just nature in itself. There's just so much beauty around us to celebrate as we reflect. And then creating these more meaningful connections. So thank you for spending a little time connecting, and hopefully that we can just continue to build upon building relationships as, again, we learn and experience of just how small really the world is. So Gwen, I'm going to shift this back to some slides. I would like to jump into some of the content. Again, as I mentioned, all this content is available for you. And again, I'm on LinkedIn. And you have my emails, my phone numbers. If I can help in any way, just let me know. I'm not necessarily looking for business. My true reason for doing this was to be supportive and appreciative and grateful for our community and wanting to contribute to that and make it a better place. And then I'll also just add, if any of you are going to ATD, which will be in Orlando this year in May, Gwen and I were also talking, hopefully we can work it out that we could all connect and call it the Hawaii delegation, that we might be able to meet there in Orlando in May. That would be great. So jumping to the next slide, I would love to just I share this in almost every presentation. I use it in almost every conversation that I have with a leader or executive and the people that I coach with. You've probably seen this before. If you heard me speak, you have heard me say this, but really just kind of linking this all back to, and you can think about this both at whatever level of system you want to think about this at, whether it be at the level of individual system or self, or thinking it really back to the level of organizational system as well. So really, what is your purpose? I love this model of Ikigai. Another word for it is, what is your raison d'etre? What is your reason for being? But if you think about this and just looking at the diagram, it's a real simple model, and just kind of thinking through this for yourself is, what is it that you, if you start at the top, what is it that you love to do combined with what the world needs? That is known as your mission. And what is it that the world needs combined with what the world is willing to pay for? That's called your vocation. What the world will pay for and what you're good at is called your profession. And what you're good at and what you love to do is your passion. Where all of that really intersects is really what you think about is purpose. So just thinking about that. Of course, I have all these pages are sourced, so take a look. There's also, Gwen, I'll send you a worksheet. I have a worksheet that I use to accompany this when I'm guiding someone through a conversation of how to think about this. If you're using, you could just use this as a great coaching tool. I've used this with my team over the years, all the time, to get people just to think about, what is their individual purpose and how that relates to the purpose of the organization, of whatever organization that you're with, of how those two align, and how, so for example, if I were to think about, my purpose and what's important to me, I may not want to work for a company that sells tobacco, so one organization, I don't think we have anyone on the call here, but I wouldn't want to, I would choose not to work at, for example, Philip Morris, so it's because of necessarily their purpose, or what they do as a company may not be in alignment with who I am as a person or my values, that I would choose to work there or choose not to work there. And I think what's really important is that, and what I just said is really thinking about that we all have a choice. So just as a humble example, and I'm not doing this to, I'm just trying to make this illustrative, just to give you an example. I'm not trying to say that mine is any better than anyone else's, but as a humble example, would just love to share on the next page, I've thought through this quite a bit, but on the next slide, you can just see my purpose is really to know significant and unconditional love. My aspirational vision is, how do I be a better citizen of the world? How do I be a better citizen of the world? That means for me, appreciation, gratefulness, gratitude, respectful of, particularly when it comes to culture, origin, race, ethnicity, and everything about what's related to that. How do I be respectful and appreciative? Because I have just so much to learn. And then my mission would be, how do I really, and this is where I spend most of my time, is how do I create greater access to learning and education, thereby increasing the economic mobility for that single person, but really more importantly for generations to come. And I can share story after story after story of people that have had, as a result of greater access to learning and education, how it changed their lives, and then more importantly, how it changed the lives of their children. And one of the things that we're always working through, for example, around the world, is this digital divide conversation. Even we talked about it in our breakouts already, of having access to the technology and the platforms that one needs to learn. But through these technological platforms that we have, we're certainly opening and creating greater access to learning and education, and thereby that influencing generations to come in a very, very positive way. So think about, for yourself, if you can, it's always good to kind of keep this in check, or with your teams, you could just do this as a great icebreaker sharing session, to kind of talk about this with yourself, your family, your colleagues, just to kind of put this in perspective. For our agenda today, and I will share with Gwen the worksheet so that you can have that. I was hoping that I wanted to just share a little bit about the growth mindset. I like to frame things around the growth mindset as we talk about having a perspective. I wanted to give you the big picture. of where are things going kind of globally. And then that's really setting context, and then kind of dropping down a little bit. What are the trends in learning? What are the implications of what that means to the workforce? What is the implications that means to HR? And how are you thinking about that in terms of your role? How are you thinking about that? And then I was able to get access to some of the most recent data coming out of ATD Global, which is the State of the Industry report. It's called the SOIR for 2021. I want to share the latest data with you there. And again, you'll have all of that data, all of those slides as well. And then some personal lessons learned, and then what is it that you can do? So to the next slide real quickly, you've heard of Carol DeWick's work on creating basically a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. I love Carol DeWick's work, and again, you can just see the implications of the difference. You can just see on the right-hand side that to the right-hand side, more of a growth mindset. And if you look to the left-hand side, as you look to the page, that's more of a fixed mindset. And you can just kind of see for yourself, just reading through that, of how we think about learning, how we think about development, and that it's an evolution, and it's something that one can do, and it's one, and it's this notion of I'm in a constant, when one makes a mistake, how are mistakes regarded? When one makes an organizational mistake or a mistake at work, that's really a learning opportunity, and that that it's something that you will be benefited by that experience, and the organization will be benefited by that experience from a learning perspective, and that it is truly developmental, and that it's all on leading on a path to greater mastery. So the notion would be that if I didn't pass, it just means that I just didn't pass yet. If I didn't get that certification, it just means that I didn't get that certification yet. And for those of us that have more of an instructional design background, if you think about it from a criterion referenced instruction model, it would be providing the remediation or the tools that would be helping people to continue to advance, so that they can continually increase or be developed to increase their level of mastery, and looking at developing a particular skill or ability. So we are going to be talking a lot more about skills later in the presentation. So I think it's an important frame to kind of keep thinking about versus a fixed mindset of having, versus having a growth mindset. One of the greatest transformations I've seen in this conversation at an organizational level is looking at Microsoft with Nardella, their new CEO. He's been in place for almost 5 years now. But he came in and he did a lot of work when he came in, brought in David Rock and neuroscience to think about really shifting from more of a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And having done that, really thinking about that he saw the organization in the past as really kind of being a know-it-all organization, and that you were respected for everything that you knew. And what he really wanted to the organization to be known for is being a learn-it-all organization, and that we're in a constant mode of learning. I also did quite a bit of work with Procter and Gamble, based out of Cincinnati, and they too have really been on this journey of really creating a growth mindset, and they're using this as sort of, if you will, the floor for all of their conversations, for all of their learning, a cultural transformation that is really based on this whole notion or this perspective of having a growth mindset. So the resource there, if you haven't had the chance to read Carol DeWick's book on growth mindset, it's excellent. So to the next slide, I'd love to ask Gwen to do a quick poll. So on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you see your organization? 1 being a fixed mindset, 2 somewhat fixed, 3 neutral, 4 somewhat growth, or just a growth mindset. And if you would just take a quick opportunity to respond to the poll that's in front of you, and then we'll be able to quickly see your results. We can get a good gist of how things are continuing to evolve and to change. So this would be the part where we're collecting data. Okay, so Gwen, can you pop up the results? Ta-da! So there we go. You can see the results for yourself, and so pretty good, you know. So moving towards, again, I almost want to do this as a continual checkpoint as to how organizations are evolving as to where you see yourself. So it's interesting having had that growth, the greatest percentage of having this growth mindset. So cool, thank you for sharing that. So moving to the next slide, I just wanted to frame sort of the big picture. I updated this as of yesterday, and really wanting to just put things in perspective. There's just so much going on the global front, and then all the way down to the low, you know, at the global level, at the geopolitical level, at the, you know, regional continent level, country level. And then, you know, if you think about the United States in particular, what's going on in the US, and then of course, think about what's going on in our state, the state of Hawaii, the 50th state, what that means. And then of course, what's happening to the learning space. But obviously there are many things that are playing influence to our world every day and have tremendously shifted where we are, where we, you know, and where, more importantly, where we're going and how that is influencing our conversations, and most importantly, the work that we do. So I just want to set the frame that from a context perspective, influences everything. And as you start looking at the research that I'm going to share with you, you're going to see, particularly coming out of McKinsey, for example, that it tremendously influences what's going on in the world today with what's going on in the broader, within the broader frame. So to the next slide, I just wanted to share the McKinsey Global Trends for 2022. This emerging data, I'm not going to read through each one, but I just wanted to, you know, really just share this. By the way, I love McKinsey, huge fan of the work that they do. They have a ton of information that's available, and you can just sign up for, you know, their daily blogs. When I just get their stuff on a daily basis. Very good, pithy research, their articles, their podcasts. Something I would strongly encourage, in addition to TED Talks, for example, or any of the consulting practices that you make, and or periodicals or newspapers that you get your sources of truth from. Wanted to you know, just make sure that you just have McKinsey on your radar screen. But you can see for yourself that really, you know, as a result of what's taking place from a pandemic perspective, that has certainly influenced our world, and will continue to influence it going into the future with the various tranches that we've had in terms of the variants. But more importantly, as we think now that as COVID moves from being a pandemic to an endemic, what does that mean for our worlds, for our society, for our countries? But you can continually just see this rebound taking place. And for Hawaii, I hope that, you know, things, because we've had this opportunity to pause and reflect, I think it gives us also a time to rethink, you know, particularly as we talk about the Hawaii Tourism Authority, for example, how they're rethinking their strategy, you know, what DeFries is thinking about as we think about smart ecotourism, sustainable solutions for Hawaii for the future, to think about our most precious asset, which is our natural resources and the beauty of Hawaii, of how we can preserve that for the future, for the Aina, for our children. But that's, you know, really important for the future. And yet, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, that we are being very conscious in terms of how that business returns to Hawaii. And of course, I think we're looking also for what that means to the Japanese market in particular, and what that means to Hawaii. But you can see there's certainly a bounce back that's occurring. But this has led to so much more innovation, greater levels of collaboration. Our ability to pivot and to transform has really taken place. And I think, you know, like in the breakouts we talked about earlier, that we've almost surprised ourselves in many ways of how this literally, expedited or accelerated our ability to change and transform as a result of COVID is, again, we're not going back to that how it was, in many cases. We're not going to do it that way because it's just permanently changed. I work for the conference board, and I can just say our ability to pivot was transformational in a very, very positive way, because it's a conference business and not for profit, but as a not for profit conference business, and we're no longer doing conferences, how they really had to change and to transform was very significant. And their ability to pivot was really rather amazing and very, very positive, and everything that we learned as a result from it. Going down, just another one that's just that stuck out for me. And of course, we're very subject to this being in Hawaii, which is of course supply chain. And we live that on a daily basis, but if you see it, kind of notion to buy it, and how we're having to adjust to that. But we've seen many labor shortages. Interesting for Hawaii, how we went from having the lowest unemployment in the country, less, 2-3%, to the highest unemployment in the country at 34%. And right now we're back down to 5-6% and headed downward. There's, the US population right now from an overall unemployment perspective back down to 5-6%. It's very interesting. And you've of course heard a lot of the research. We'll talk about this a bit more, the Great Resignation. But right now in the US population, there are some 11 million jobs that are open right now. And so I think we're having to rethink. There's been many businesses that their growth has been stunted as a result of them not being able to open businesses or them to be able to expand and grow because they just don't have the talent. Particularly in the space that I'm in, which is the hospitality space, many companies have been having to reframe how they provide services, amenities to customers. Are they going to open, reduce hours, reduce services? What that means, some hotels are not even able to open. McDonald's, for example, is not able to open. They're having to shut down in shifts. Some are not returning to, for example, table service. They're all just sticking to takeout service. And again, this is also generated, Uber Dash, Uber Foods, all this is generated to how that's shifting in terms of new opportunities and new business opportunities as well, having to adjust to that. And so there's a great deal of restructuring, reconfiguring that's taking place, I think, both from a business perspective and again, how we're going to talk about this a bit more, but what is the work, how the work gets done, where it gets done, all of that has been evolving and is changing. And this last one that I think is really important is that climate change is real. And that as we can see climate temperatures or global temperatures rising for our seas, what that means. And I am ever present of that when I think about erosion, for example, on our shores here in Hawaii. It is very, very real. So going to the next slide, I pulled this from Deloitte. I really like this because it's a very simple slide. Feel free to steal this for your work, but just really thinking about, first of all, what is the work and the work itself, and asking yourself the question, what of that can be automated, or what is open for that for being automated? And that's a critical question of how you think about the work itself. And again, that all shifting. And then the discussion around workforce, who can do, who's going to do that work? And again, that's all shifting as well. So when you think about the shared services or managed services, for example, does that need to be done under our talent, or could that be done? Could we look to buy that talent? Could we to buy that product or service versus having that be internal? And then what are the trade-offs that one must think about to be able to do that, of course, successfully? And then workplace, where is it that we're calling work? And of course, you've kind of seen the impact that that's had to the commercial real estate space, for example, and how that's shifting. My sister-in-law, for example, works at Hawaiian Electric. They're not back in the office. And and many people are on a varied schedule, or, having to, again, to adjust to how they think about returning to work. So this whole discussion is certainly up for grabs. And again, I think we as learning professionals need to think about how we're adapting and pivoting in terms of how we're shifting to be able to accommodate to this ever-changing reality, and that in many cases, it's not going to go back to the way that it was. And that's, I think, really important. So to the next slide, when we think about greater autonomy for our employees, our team members, our associates, really this discussion around people are really rethinking about the discussion around work, what it means to me, how much I want to work, how much I need to work, where I will work, and the ability to take that virtual. And in some ways, that has made, that's created, again, a lot of opportunities, but I just know from a lot of my colleagues that were based on the mainland, and because a lot of their work can be done virtual, they're all saying they want to come to Hawaii. And of course, that's already creating a ripple effect for housing in Hawaii, but thinking about, again, where that work gets done, how it gets done, who's doing it, and how much of it do I just want to do? How does that impact, yourself, and how people are really adjusting and changing to say, I may not want to sign up for that particular program or that particular lifestyle. I may want to actually change my lifestyle as a result of that and making other decisions. And what's underneath a lot of these, and we think about how the workplace is shifting and how the workforce is shifting, the thing that we see shifting along with it is this focus to skills. And so to the next slide, I really take a lot of value in looking at what are these 56 skills, that these are the top skills that McKinsey has deemed, both on the cognitive, interpersonal, self-leadership, and digital, that these are the top skills that are emerging, that really we need to be ever present. And so the other shift that we're seeing is we did a lot of work around competency development, and certainly that's important, and that we've spent a lot of time thinking about competencies and how that rolls up to basically a job description. And now we're seeing this, that's evolving into the shift into the discussion around skills. And so we're breaking up those jobs. It's really not about a job description anymore. It's around what are the skills that make up that particular job, and what are those particular parts of those jobs that are continuing to evolve and to change, that could either be done, that are scalable and repeatable, that could be done through automation or through managed services or outsourced. That, again, that's all shifting. And what are the emerging skills that we will need for the future? And so you can look at this from both a cognitive, and of course, the ones that bring highest level for me on the cognitive side would be critical thinking. And again, where we get those, how we develop those skills, of course, is a place that we play in directly, but be thinking around your curriculum that you're developing. How are you touching, if these are the emerging skills from a cognitive, interpersonal, digital, and leadership, a self-leadership perspective, what are you doing to address these needs in being able to shift? And you can see the interpersonal skills. Many people, by the way, and I don't like the term, and you'll see it's reflected in the deck a little later, I'm not a big fan of the word of soft skills, because they're not soft in any way or shape or form. They're really, really important. And so these important interpersonal skills, or the ability to work and to collaborate with one another across different geographies, different time zones, is very, very critical. So those skills, the ability to collaborate and to be part of a team, are very important. To the next slide, you can look at some of the self-leadership skills that are ever important. And most importantly, what I would just say that I'd have you to think about, and I know all of you know this already, but it's just, managing self, and having that having a greater level of self-awareness is really where that all starts from. And that all leadership really starts from having greater self-awareness, leads then to being able to better understand oneself, and then being able to better lead and to manage others. And then this shift that many organizations have been continually moving along the path of a digital transformation, but how we continually to expand and to think digitally. And just an interesting example, when COVID occurred, and just how there was probably in the past a great deal of more in many organizations resistance to move towards having a more digital capability. And then overnight, COVID happened. And so I was working with a couple of organizations, and they were trying to implement, Microsoft Teams, for example, or Slack. And there was a lot of resistance to doing it. And then, of course, with COVID that hit, immediately everyone was using Microsoft Teams, or they were using Slack, for example, and how quickly the world shifted. And now they're saying, what else can we do? What other platforms can we use? And of course, here we are using Zoom today. And of course, whatever platform you may use for, conferencing, and now how we're trying to enhance that capability to make it even that much more in person. And of course, the shift to now being able to do that in a hybrid environment is also very important as well. So all of this linking these 56 skills in, again, self-leadership, digital, interpersonal, and cognitive, all leading to the influence that the learning organization plays, the role that you play is critical in being able to do that. By the way, I've been spending a lot of time talking about this notion of talent marketplace, and thinking about that either from a TAC perspective, from a talent acquisition, perspective, but some of the new providers that are in this thinking about talent mobility, some of the emerging, very entrepreneurial, innovative providers in that space, like Eightfold, Glint, Gloat, BetterUp, that this is really emerging in terms of how we're thinking about being able to think about how we attract talent into our organization through our acquisition tools, from a digital perspective using AI and machine learning. And then at the same time, from an internal mobility perspective, being able to do that. And when we think about internal mobility, most importantly, then we think about then how are we helping people to continue to further advance? And it's much more than just career pathing, but how we're thinking about helping people to advance, to expand on their set of skills, to keep them evergreen for the future. And that ties directly back to sustainability. But that notion of what are we doing from a learning and development perspective to help the organization develop those skills. So to the next slide, when I think about modern learning, I kind of love these. I talk about these 10 things all the time, but these are the what I would call the important elements of what modern learning should be, and that your solutions really need to be thinking about these 10 things. And at the center, and it leads back to what we talked about before, this notion of being adaptive, autonomous, current, hyperlinked, social, personal, experiential, MVAC, which stands for it needs to be mobile, video, auditory, and then kinesthetic, my ability to see, touch, or feel it. Signing off, Andrew, I know you had to buzz, but thank you for joining us. Aloha. And then accessibility, and then of course, chunked. And when we say chunked, ever smaller chunks, and then autonomous. So take a look at, again, MVAC, yeah. So mobile, again, mobile devices, all being accessible through your devices being critical. Video at the center of how we're learning is critical. Auditory, and then kinesthetic, I can see it, feel it, touch it, experiment with it, play with it, really important. Then to the next slide, as we think about this really a learner-centered ecosystem or platform, just thinking at the starts really, again, this is but much more of a cycle, but it starts with your curriculum, how that then blends into the experience or the on-the-job experience, and how learning that we talk about the 5 moments of need, for example, about Moshe's work around this, which I think is really good, in being able to think about, work being, learning taking place in the flow of work, being critical, then being able to get coaching and being able to learn socially through others on platforms that we have to collaborate with one another. That then creates greater learning and then greater advancement opportunities for me and the people within the organization. And then collaborative groups or affinity groups that come together, that creates, again, greater diversity in the organization and greater inclusion and belonging. That this is how it, again, ties back to having a very sustainable solution. And then that really creates a culture of learning, and most importantly, this notion of lifelong learning. And we are at the helm and of being able to do that from our function. And by the way, I would say with everything happening with COVID, for example, that I see this as learning's day in the sun, that this is, just like the best of times to be in a learning organization, because it has just accelerated everything that it's all about learning, and the shift to learning and how we're able to support and lead the business, and how that ties directly to creativity and to innovation and having this entrepreneurial spirit. It ties back to learning and that notion of having, again, when we tied back earlier to DeWick's work around having a growth mindset, again, that this is foundational to being able to have a growth mindset, to be curious, leading to greater innovation, greater learning, collaboration, and then the growth of the organization as well. The best example I can give you there is I just think about pharma, and if pharma just places, as such an influence of such a focus on R&D, because that's really where it's all about the future in developing new solutions for the future. If I think about the consulting space, same, because it's all about their talent. The only asset truly that many consulting organizations have is their people or their peeps, and that's the talent. So that talent continually has to be learning, investing in that talent so that it's continually learning, because that's really what they're selling. They're selling knowledge, know-how, skills, and abilities. That's what they're selling. So as we think about from a training, from a perspective, then from a learning perspective, the next slide just talks about how we continually see the shift taking place and what are some of the trends for 22. You can see this. I'm thinking already greater. The first I put at the top of the list, upskilling and reskilling. I'm not a real big fan of those words of upskilling and reskilling because it implies that you're not good enough. So from a growth mindset, I really like to think of it more as future skilling. What are we doing to future skill or future enable an organization, thinking about that? So thinking about simulations, clear communications, gamification, thinking about 5 generations in the workforce, millennials in the workforce, digital natives, how they're mastering mobile learning, again, chunk size, better analytics, data coming out of that, that influencing AI, artificial intelligence, that then influencing machine learning in being able to help us move faster, better, making then, of course, better decisions and growing for the future. And you can just see across the areas what's important of what's changing. But again, at the top here on number 10, I like the importance of diversity, inclusion, and of course, belonging being very important to that. Well-being, customer education, being customer focused, and that a lot of that is being intuitive. So if you look at any, for example, Google solutions or many of your Apple customers, that all of that is just being learned in the flow of work and at the moment, and there's no user's guide for that. You're just learning it. And again, that we're using that through the design, intelligent design, in the way that we design solutions or the way that we design learning, so that learning is taking place within the use of that product, tool, or platform. Cybersecurity, cryptocurrency, also very important as we can think about how, again, our reliance upon technology is ever making the world to shift and move faster. As you know, with what's going on in Ukraine, the impact that will happen with SWIFT for Russia, for example, that will be a great influence on how, being able to have digital currency and the way be able to move funds around the world is going to be very important. So these, again, 18 trends for the workplace. What is the impact on the next slide? And this just kind of summarizing this up, but the notion of hybrid is the new normal, and that the new currency is speed, the ability to get things done, and then your ability to be resilient, on the back end of that, your ability to stay and be resilient. Arianna Huffington's work around Thrive and being able to be resilient is really important. Enhanced immersive technology, again, embedded in the platforms itself. Increased workloads, so it's the ability to how we manage that. L&D is leading this change effort, and we having to adapt to these different digital formats. And again, the interconnectedness of these solutions. I just see it interesting that we spent a lot of time before talking about LMSs. We're not even really talking about LMSs. That just seems so second nature to us. We have been talking a lot about LXPs, learning experience platforms, and now we seem to be shifting into these conversations that are all integrated from a user perspective, from an LXP combined with that of a talent marketplace, and how we're talking about then skills, linking that to skills, to the skills architecture, to the skills taxonomy, thinking about that then leading towards how one then advances learning and learning to greater mastery, leading to greater opportunities. And again, all of that in service of being aligned to the business, all of that in being in service to the aligned to the business, and of course the learning function. So what that means to HR, the implications then to HR is how that kind of plays itself out, and where that's emerging to is, I love this, is around balance. So how are we creating greater balance as the lines continue to blur between the work itself, workplace, and the workforce, as those continue to blur. How we think about then creating greater balance by having greater well-being, how we think about belonging and inclusion, how we think about, most importantly, around experience. And now experience tied directly to culture is going to be one of the key things that, as we look around to think about the Great Resignation, we think then, what are the true organizations that are going to be able to succeed, are going to be those that have truly an engaged workforce, very strong cultures that are attached to a growth mindset and to culture of that employee experience that is driving, all tied back to purpose, therefore then creating greater affinity and then leading to greater retention. And then are being able to do that in a very adaptive and agile way, and continually looking into how, from an HR perspective, we will be able to digitize that across the board on a global basis. A good book that was written by the leaders of Korn Ferry, I might want to suggest, is called Talent Wins, but it really talks about HR. And by the way, if you look at all of the studies, Booz, Deloitte, KPMG, Ernst & Young, Accenture, the Conference Board, Burson, if you look at all of the data that talks about from the perspective of the CEO, what is keeping CEOs up at night more than anything else is talent. Is really all about HR. So the strategic role that HR is playing in organizations today is absolutely critical. And how we're thinking about that for the future of an organization is directly tied from an HR perspective of being able to do that. So I just want to kind of show this, how it's all interconnected and how it all plays. To the next slide, also, what are the 5 most strategic priorities thinking about this? But it's really tying back to well-being. There's this real shift, a very close second to diversity and inclusion. And yet a lot of the research that I've been reading of recent it's saying that while there's been, Trayvon Martin, and you kind of look at it just even recently with a colleague from Deloitte, back in New York, which just happened, we still have so much work to do from a diversity, inclusion, and belonging perspective. And organizations are being held accountable for this. And one of the things that I'm encouraged to see, and it's taking place, from an SEC perspective, is there are new rules, and I'd be happy to talk about this in a separate session, but bring someone that could help talk about this with our chapter. But there are a lot of new rules that are emerging in terms of what organizations are going to, if you are publicly traded, of what you are going to have to report in addition to financial data and transparency, of what you're going to have to be able to show and reflect from a human capital perspective. And that's now part of the law, and that you are now having to report, for example, on your composition of your workforce, that you are having to report on that and those requirements around human capital. So it's important, and our ability to report on that and get better at that and drive to those greater levels of equality and equity are becoming very much tied in now to the direct success of an organization. So leadership development, employee experience, you can just go down the list and see where the shift, upskilling the workforce, having enough talent to do the job, learning transformation, analytics, and you can still see that it's still nascent in some ways, but it's now on the radar screen where it wasn't even before, that we were talking about, AI for HR, ML for HR, machine learning for HR, and that all of us being able to make these better decisions. I particularly follow Burning Glass or MC, for example, in the data that they're revealing. Or a good example that I can give you that you probably have heard about before is that LinkedIn example, where just by looking at the results from how your employees are behaving from a LinkedIn perspective, I can predict their desire to stay or to leave your organization just by looking at their click behavior, as we look at their click behavior within your organization. And and we probably have seen some of the videos or movies in this space, but how that's being so telltale in terms of how the organization is behaving, or how people are behaving, and they're making decisions for themselves for the future. This is important for us to just think about, as, again, we are enabling all of this for the organizations that we support and we work with. We're enabling that. So now what I'd like to do is to shift us in the short remaining time that we have to really think, and this report is available if you also have your national membership. You have your ability to have access to the full report, to the full PDF of this as well. Make sure that you get it. This is always this data. These slides are important because they take all of that report and they make it into these pithy slides. That's why I like this report and being able to share it with you. But do take a look. It's again online. It's been produced for many, many years, and you can just we're going to look at the data and how it's rolling. But you can see this composition for this report is being produced from 223 organizations that are reporting. And this goes back again to, this data is actually, so it goes back to 2020 data. This is actually when it's pulled. It gets reported in 21. So you can just see the organization, the end value for those organizations, of that 223 organizations that contributed to that, the end value for the size of the organization for 1 to 499 employees is 94. Between 500 and 1,000 is the end value is 95, and to 10,000 plus input, the end value is 34. So keep that in mind on the frame. To the next slide, we're going to look at teasing out the benchmark groups of what are the benchmark groups, and then what is the best data, meaning those organizations that our best for ATD, that are best contributors that we're looking and teasing out their data. So this is the format on the next slide really quickly, just in terms of how they collect that. They do it on an annual basis. If you have the opportunity to contribute to it, we really appreciate when you do. But the way they collect the data, it's then, you know, teased out, summarized, and then put into a comparative format, and then shared as the State of the Industry report that we can share with you. So how we define direct learning experience, to the next slide, is what it means by direct learning experience, and then because when we define it, or what it includes and what it does not include, we have to be very specific at what it includes so that we're comparing apples to apples. So it does not, for example, it does not include travel expenses. Does not include travel expenses. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that it actually went down. This surprised me a little bit, but we haven't seen the, you know, this is 2020 information, and I think it's going to shift significantly in 2021. But the average spend went down actually about 3% to spending approximately $1,267. And, you know, if we look at the IMF, IMF data, that the global economy did shrink by 3%. So you can kind of see that it's there's a direct, you could say that there's a direct correlation there. To the next slide, you know, what are greater context of what's been going on? And you can just see, obviously we had COVID. You can see some of the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the shift towards telework or the shift of remote work, of what impact that has. And of course, that in many cases, many companies were impacted negatively by, of course, COVID. We saw a downturn and the need for government intervention to help support organizations to get through this period. And of course, you can see in Hawaii, for example, our unemployment spiked at approximately 34%. The next slide, looking at what the average spend is, you can just see where the average spend is and how the BLS data, and then consolidated, you can just look at the shift, but the data being approximately $1,200, $267 being sent per employee on their development. I still think, you know, that that's just a drop in the bucket of it roughly says it's somewhere, the statistic has always been roughly between 2 and 3% of payroll. And, you know, that's still, you know, you would probably hear Tom Peters say that that's still a dreadful statistic, that the spend on organizations for talent, for workforce development is somewhere between 2 and 3% is still very concerning. To the next slide, you can see how it shifts out and breaks out by, if we were to look at the shift in the size of the organization and how that shifts out. You can see for yourself. And then, you know, thinking about why ATD does not measure ROI, but basically there's still a lot more work to be done on that. Another resource I can suggest with you, I was a founding member working with Dave Vance on the work of the Center for Talent Development Reporting. I would encourage you to check out that website. And again, we'd be happy to even do a session on that, but thinking about how we measure, you know, Patty and Jack Phillips, for example, how we look at Brinkerhoff, or we look at, you know, 5 levels of learning, for example, you know, all of that work that we just still are nascent as many learning organizations, of being able to say that we're really to take that to that level. And we still have a lot of work to do to get better at really measuring and calculating, you know, calculating ROI. So the next slide, we now look at defining hours used real quickly. And then I would look at the next slide of just talking about per employee. So now we look at an upward tick of hours of 45 hours. Again, and you could compare, again, I share this data with you because it allows you then to, like, what is your data for your organization and how does that compare to, you know, to what you see here as the State of the Industry report. To the next slide, you can take a look at now, we saw, you know, slightly up, and then look at the expenditure of how that breaks out. And of course, that includes tuition reimbursement. But if you look to the next slide, you can see how that breaks out in terms of how those monies are spent between tuition reimbursement, supplier expenses, and internal costs if they would have their own learning and internal learning organization. And looking at, what is being offered, what is being delivered, and for you to think about it strategically. Are you making your investments in learning? Are you spending that in the right place, in terms of your offerings and for the population for which you're investing? Are you investing that in the right place in your organization? If you look at where it shakes out in terms of the organizational level, you can take a look of how all of those dollars get spent. To the next slide, you can see that at the top of the list, a lot of that still focuses, to the next slide, around compliance, and then all the way down to employee orientation. But again, you can see how that breaks out then from a perspective of how that money gets allocated. And then hours used of technology. And this is interesting to see, but it's continually shifting. And obviously, you're going to see it shift and probably spike this next year because of COVID, of how we're shifting to, again, using technology platforms to be able to deliver that training versus it being done in person. To the next slide, you can also see how e-learning is now continually and what device it's taking place on, and how that's shifting, and how, again, we're moving from in-person to synchronous to asynchronous to, again, being able to develop that all in e-learning. How we then define on-the-job learning, and then looking at what's emphasized in all the job learning. To the next slide, of being able to think about, where the focus is of on-the-job learning. And I'm just conscientious of the time, and I want to just jump us ahead to some quick learnings and I've shared this before, and I don't change it, because these continue to be my latest learning. I would just say is just really around being adaptive and appreciative, and then grateful. But this notion around executive support, executive sponsorship is really what I think makes the difference for a great learning organization. Having the right people in the right place on the bus, and then your ability to move them around, of having that fungible talent that is, being able to adapt and to change is just priceless. And then a relentless focus on the customer, and then having the courage to disrupt and to change. And I just like to just go to the next slide and just think about, I'm just appreciative of that all becomes a process where we're thinking about being agile. Our organized speed is the new currency to be adapted to change. Thinking about how that builds into aligning with our culture, how we then think about building that in, and that becomes knowledge and learning for the organization, celebrating that success and then repeating it again. What can you do as a leader in the space? Be an example, be a learn-it-all person, be curious, be innovative, challenge the status quo, take those risks, communicate openly, be sincere, authentic, be a great leader in our space, invest in yourself, invest in others. And my last kind of slide here is just really being a curious learner, being appreciative, continually paying it forward. I love the notion of Live Aloha. I have the bumper sticker, and all that leads to just being really appreciative and forever respectful of our kupuna, and forever respectful of our aina. And just to say that on the last slide, those are my parents. They've both passed, but there's just not a day or a time that I don't think about them, that I'm appreciative for all that they have done for me, for my family. And again, we live in the wonderful opportunity to be able to pay that forward. And for that, I am very appreciative. And again, if I can be of service to help you in any way, feel free to reach out and let's schedule some time to chat And thank you. Any quick questions? And again, happy to hang on a bit here, but any quick questions, thoughts, reactions as I share this with you? Just reading the chats as we've been going around. Thank you. I know many of you have other meetings as well. Any quick questions? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kimo, for sharing your mana'o with us. We really appreciate it. And I know that everybody has meetings to go to, so we will end this really quickly. Kimo will be around for a little bit longer if any of you have any questions, but feel free to check out our website at atdhawaii.org. We do have some upcoming events. We will actually have our first in-person event upcoming on March 31st at Restaurant 604 in Pearl Harbor, so please keep an eye out for that. Registration will be opening soon. Other than that, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. And it was great to see everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.
I plan to go to the event on March 31st, so hope to see you all there. And I hope to see you also in Orlando if you're going to go to Orlando.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Aloha. I'll hang for a bit if anyone wants to chat.
Aloha, Kimo.
Hey, Makana. How are you?
For
Yeah.
Good.
Right.
You know, you showed some research about how well-being and mental health were extremely important. And what I'm finding, because I'm in the well-being space,
Right,
is employers are saying, well, we can get free training from our EAP from people who are overworked and aren't really trainers, and just go in, do an hour lunch and learn. And I'm wondering, how do you, is there a way to get employers to be more focused on actual real change rather than just coming in and doing a song and dance?
What I have seen at the core of that, just a perspective, is what's driving, particularly with COVID, is around flexibility. And that if you kind of think about underneath all of this is organizations need to be more flexible, which then means that organizations need to be more collaborative and teamwork needs to be a better presence so that they are being able to, that if I need to spend time to go, take my kids to go for a baseball game, I can do that throughout the course of my day because I have the trust, and that's why it goes back to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But I have the ability so that I can achieve that ability of well-being. There's been, I would say, this is leapfrogged in many ways, and where organizations, so that has created, I think, more opportunity for the space. But what we really need to see is around how leaders be intentional. And I think intentionality is really at the core. And so what I've also seen many organizations do is they've been trying to do better in terms of setting up boundaries. So, and now that's being built into many platforms. So I don't know if if you use Outlook, for example, and I continually get the email, you may want to think about sending this email during normal business hours. So it's now so you have to think about how we build that into the woodwork and how we build that into process so that organizations, it becomes, that's sort of the way of doing business. And I know, for example, many organizations, and I tried to model it today, are trying to build in better connection into every meeting, so that you are being intentional that we spend the first X number of minutes being more intentional by building in connection and building that in as part of the meeting. I'm going to be doing a 2-day meeting coming up tomorrow, and we're building in these intentional breaks, again, to build community as well. And then that leads people to sharing about their personal selves And then that, of course, leads to them sharing about their well-being. And then how are they being able to share strategies around how they're, being better at being more holistic and better balanced at being able to approach this. And so I think organizations are looking at creating also better norms around, no meeting Fridays even, or, that they're trying to build this more into infrastructure of how they think about things. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think that there are the organizations that are learning that it shouldn't all be on the person. And I've been working a lot with well-being with lawyers. And so we're trying to convince the firms that yes, yoga is great, breathing is great, meditation is great for your employees. But if you don't change the system, if you don't change the structure, the culture, then you're still going to have people burning out. The average recidivism or turnover rate for associates before COVID was 17% were leaving within 3 years. Now it's almost 30% are leaving, and that's hugely expensive to the law firms.
Absolutely.
And they have to realize that they need to change their structures.
Yeah. And then I think to your point around making a strategic decision of what gets done in-house, what can we do out of, what can we think about as a managed service to be able to do that for us? And I would hope that people would be able to operate at, at higher levels, more strategic. Obviously, those become greater billable hours as well, if they can operate more strategically. Interesting. Good data.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for this session. It was very thought-provoking. And thank you, Gwen.
Thank you,
And
Gwen.
hope to see you folks in March.
I'll see you in March. I'll be there.
Really great
I'll
to
plan to
see
be
you.
there. Take
Okay,
care.
great.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Thank you so much, Kimo.
Sure. My pleasure. Aloha.
Take it. Oh, before I forget, I'm
Yeah.
gonna share the slide deck. Did you want me to remove the picture of your parents?
Nah, you can leave it in.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to
I'll
check
send
with
you that worksheet for Ikigai so you can include that as well.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you so
Okay,
much, Kimo.
thanks.
Really appreciate
Okay, bye.
it.
Aloha.
Take care. Aloha.